Let's get her rolling. Welcome, everyone, to MarshWatch number 6. This is the fifth ID session of the series so far. I'm coming at you today from beautiful, currently not raining or snowing yet, Saskatoon, which encompasses um, the which encompasses the traditional lands of the Cree, Dakota, Nakota, Saulteaux, and Stoney First Nations, as well as the homeland of the Métis people. It's also where I call home these days. It's been a while. It's been about 11 years. My name, of course, is Leanne Latremoy. Don't worry too much about the last name. Leanne, the bird lady, usually gets it close enough. I have the immense pleasure of working for Birds Canada, and believe it or not, this is part of my job. So, Birds Canada, we're a national not-for-profit. We're found across Canada, and our mission is to drive action to increase the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of birds in Canada. And hopefully, with programming like this, we can share our enthusiasm and passion for the natural world and the habitats that the critters we love depend on. I do have an immense fondness for wetland places. Today, we're going to be covering we're not going to do amphibians. It's all birds today. I should have changed that slide. So that'll be recorded and posted online, and then we will do some quizzes and just some general chit chat afterwards. Birds today. This is the diver session. I am excited for this one because it is all ducks, and it's the sort of thing that keeps growing on me every year. I keep adding more to it. So these are the main core species we're going to be focusing on today. We've got the Canvasback and the Redhead, two very close lookalikes, the ringneck duck and the lesser Scaup, another two close lookalike, as well as the Ruddy Duck and the Bufflehead. But because we often encounter a bunch of other diving ducks on migration and in big enough numbers, and people have asked me about them enough, we have some bonus birds too. So we're also going to cover greater Scaup, which, as you might imagine, looks a heck of a lot like the lesser Scaup. And I've added the Mergansers. We've got the hooded Merganser, which stands out on its own, the common Merganser, and the red-breasted Merganser. The drakes of those two are quite different looking, but the hens are tricky. So hopefully we'll have enough time to go over all of those. I'm excited for it. So let's get her rolling. Just as a reminder, diving ducks, like their name suggests, they dive underwater for food, and they are adapted to that sort of lifestyle. Generally speaking, their feet are farther back on their body than dabblers, and that is for propulsion. It's really, really efficient to swim underwater when you've got, your power coming from directly behind you and not in the middle of you. They tend to have small wings for their body size, which means that they can't generate a ton of lift. So these are ducks that would be stranded if they were trying to fly off of land. They would have to, waddle over to the water, and we'll see some of them do, walk fairly well. But as you can see on this gorgeous redhead here, those legs are pretty far back on the body. That is going to be an awkward duck on land. So they need a runway to take off because they don't have as much wing surface as the dabbling ducks. So they will flap, flap, flap their wings, and they will run like heck, and then they'll eventually start getting some lift, and then they'll keep running and splashing on the water. It's really cool to see. It always makes me smile because it just kind of looks silly. They're just running on the surface of the water, but they get it done. They also tend to fly with fast and quicker wing beats than dabbling ducks. And again, this is because they have those smaller wings for their body size. It's great underwater, but it is not, the most efficient for flying. So they do tend to flap. So it's the sort of thing that eventually, if you start looking at a lot of ducks and you see a lot of them flying, you will notice that the ones that really, flap their wings really strongly are going to be the diving ducks. Just to recap, we've talked a lot about dabbler hens and diver hens, and separating those ducks into those two groups is really useful and can even be done even easier with the hens. The dabbler hens, they nest, in the upland habitat. They're the ones nesting in kind of grassy, fieldy areas, and so their coloration reflects their desire to camouflage in that habitat. So they're really heavily patterned with shades of brown and straw colored. They're really complexly patterned. They just seem kind of brown and streaky, but if you zoom in close, you see there's often a fair amount of intricate detail on their feathers. The diver hens, on the other hand, they kind of have the opposite strategy, and that's based on where they nest. So they'll often be nesting right over the water or right next to the water, or a lot of them do nest in tree cavities. And they all want to look kind of dark to blend in with that background. The ones that are over near water, they just kind of want to look like that dark pond water. And the same thing for the ones that are in, a tree cavity. They just want to look darker and be able to blend into that darker environment. So they have more plain, more uniform body feathers that tend to be a little bit darker. They can obviously be a little bit pale, especially some of the fresh feathers that have fresh edges on them. But overall, more plain body feathers than, say, the dabbling hens. So that can be a quick way to just lump the hens together. Even if you're not at the stage where you can identify them, you can at least lump them just by their plumage, which is pretty cool. Okay, the first dabbling duck is got to be one of the most gorgeous ducks that exists. This is the canvasback. They are large diving ducks. If you ever get to see them, they are larger than a lot of the other ducks on the water. They're going to be similar in size. I think to a mallard, they're quite large. And the key here, again, we're always going to be trying to focus on the white if the duck has white, is the canvasback really does have a bright white canvas back and body. That is the thing that is going to stick out like a sore thumb at a great distance because there really is just a ton of that bright white on their body. And the other thing that really tips you off to this being a canvasback is they have a pretty unique head shape. They have this gentle sloping forehead. It really is kind of unique, and we'll compare them, side by side with the similar looking redhead soon enough. But I remember, when I first started doing ducks a bit more seriously, I was coming out to the prairies for the first time, and I knew I had to get better with my ducks because we didn't see a ton of them back east. I didn't always get a good chance to practice on a wide variety. And I remember just sitting there looking at my field guide going, how in the heck am I gonna tell the canvasback from the redhead apart? All I could focus on was two ducks with a red head. And so I want you to focus not quite on the red head. I want you to focus on their back and their body color. So they kind of look like an Oreo as some of the Scaup do as well, with dark front and a dark back, but really that huge, or dark rear end, sorry, that huge white area on their back and flanks. I just want you to think bright white canvas. Really, really gorgeous, nice sloping forehead. The wings, as you'll see in a lot of the diving species, aren't really that exciting. They don't have that bright speculum patch. They're in a few species, the wing patterning can be helpful, but a lot of them, they're just kind of plain looking. So we will focus a little bit less on that. If you do get to see them up close, they have this really gorgeous red eye color. Just such a neat looking bird. The hens are plain brown overall, and thankfully, kind of like the shoveler hen, the head shape, along with the sloped bill, really is distinctive in terms of shape. There isn't going to be another duck that you'll see that has quite that sloped forehead. You can imagine if you got a little person who's like perched on the top, they've got their skis. If they're heading down, nobody's terrified. It's like, okay, this is a nice, gentle, manageable slope for them. Remember that for when we get back to the redhead. So the hen is warm brown overall. Just have a kind of it's maybe less of an eye-ring, more just like kind of pale coloration around the eye, a little bit of a pale throat, and she has a nice dark eye. Really, the thing that stands out is that head shape. Again, very large duck. If you're seeing it out with a bunch of others, it is going to look noticeably larger than most of the other species around it. So nice, big, sloped forehead. And I know I mentioned this before, but I'll say it again in this one. Especially in the springtime, that can be a really useful time to start getting a feel for those hens because most of the ducks are arriving paired or they're going to be pairing soon after arrival. So you'll often see, drakes and hens together. So you can hopefully do a little bit of association. They're like, okay, the shape is really looking similar. And then you go back in your field guide and maybe you've got a little bit of a liane going in your head and you can remember some of the things I've said. But springtime can be a really good time to get a handle on some of those hens that can be otherwise rather tricky. This is an omnivorous diver. They're going to be going after aquatic plant material, especially, so seeds, buds, leaves, rhizomes, tubers, roots of all kinds of aquatic plants. They'll also, of course, go for insects and their larvae, as well as snails. You'll often see canvasback on deep water marshes, small lakes, and sheltered bays. And if you don't believe me that they go like rooting around for roots, take a look at this drake. His head is completely covered in mud, so they really do go underwater and root around in, the vegetation, where it's anchored, where the roots are. So kind of hilarious. You see this hen here, warm brownish overall. Again, it has that really gentle sloping forehead. The bill is large, it kind of goes along that gentle sloping head and forehead area. Most of the divers aren't that chatty, so we'll listen to some of them, but don't focus on sound being a terribly useful clue for these guys. You don't hear most of them very often at all. And so, Canvasback kind of looks like a woo, or sounds like a woo. So that's the Drake's kind of courtship noises. As with all the other ducks, they do have generic quacks, and the females have their own quacks, but those are really tough to tell apart. I am no good at telling quacks apart of ducks. I think that's something that you would do if you were like really hardcore into waterfowl. And especially, like I know hunters get really into like knowing a lot of the quack calls, and they can imitate some of them quite well. I am not that person, and I think it's really hard to get into. So they do make other quacky noises, all of the ducks, just by and large, it's not the most useful clue to the ID. Canvasbacks have a fairly wide distribution across North America. You don't see them back east very much. You'll get them a little bit, on migration, and sometimes you'll get them wintering on the southern Great Lakes, but otherwise, on the breeding grounds, they tend to be kind of a central and northern species. Next up, we have the fabulous redhead. This is the other one in my book where I was going, oh my gosh, two ducks with red heads. How can I tell them apart? And that's where, again, we're not going to be focusing on the red of them. I mean, obviously that'll get you down to these two species with that bill shape, but really, I want you to focus on the back here. And you'll notice here on the redhead that it is gray overall. If you zoomed in really, really close, it would actually be, little bits of white and black or grayish that kind of have that fine patterning. At a distance, that totally just reads as a gray coloration. They're a medium-sized diving duck, so they're going to be smaller than the canvasback, and they have a steep forehead. So if you imagine being a little person with strapped into your skis and you're about to go off of this, you're going to be looking at a black diamond, and a lot of people are going to be going, no, this isn't for me. This is really, really steep. So that head shape is also a clue. So even if you do happen to focus on, rusty red head, that forehead shape is really, really useful in telling those two apart. The drakes are obviously, again, quite handsome, but very similar in color patterning to that canvasback, again, with the black kind of chest area, black rump, reddish looking head, but that gray body overall, gray body, gray back coloration. That's the thing to key in on those two species. They have kind of a yellowish eye, and they are quite handsome little guys. Again, the wing, not terribly exciting or, the most useful in an ID context, but there is for you anyway. Let's take a look at the hen. And again, this is going to be one of the trickier ones to tell apart, and we'll spend a bit of time telling the redhead hens apart from a few other ones. But she has that steep forehead, and overall, another kind of warm brownish. The back tends to be a little bit darker. She's got a dark eye, does have a bit of an eye ring, a little bit of white eyeshadow, especially oftentimes a little patch kind of below and behind the eye, but it is a small kind of faint patch. That's something that at a far distance, you're not really going to be able to pick up on because it is kind of subtle. The base of the bill is a little bit paler overall. And again, a nice little dark eye, but fairly generic looking diver hen, dark bill, brownish overall, not a lot of patterning to go by. And don't worry, we'll compare a bunch of diving hens together. This is another omnivorous diver. They're going to be eating a lot of aquatic plant material, so the seeds, leaves, buds, rhizomes, tubers, very much like the canvasback, as well as insects and larvae, and snails. And here's proof in the pudding that they really do eat a fair bit of plant matter. This has got to be one of the best redhead photos that exists. You can really just see he's just stuffing his face with that. You can see that little bit of a defined white eye-ring, a little bit of white eyeshadow that's kind of peeking along the back there. Otherwise, jet black bill. The drakes have kind of, a lighter grayish bill that's like dipped in black, and then that black borders a bit of a paler area. But really the thing that stands out is kind of this Oreo cookie, front, back, and then that gray in the middle as opposed to the white canvas back. And this is another one where you don't hear them very often, but they are kind of hilarious. And you'll find redheads in a variety of wetland sizes. They'll tolerate a bit shallower wetlands than, say, a canvasback would normally go after. They do sound kind of hilarious. It almost doesn't sound like that's a real noise that a duck could make, but there you have it, the woo of the redhead. Oops. Redhead has kind of an interesting disjunct distribution. The big portion of it is kind of in that central North American area. There is a blob of them in Alaska, and you'll also find them kind of in the St. Lawrence Valley. Other places you'll find them in passage, and of course, further south in the non-breeding zones. Comparing the two diving ducks with the redheads, and I'll preface this by saying normal duck-like bills, because we'll look at the mergansers a little bit later, and those have very different looking bills. Some of them will have some red on their heads, but the bills are just wildly different. These guys look like more typical duck bills. So, comparing the canvasback and the redhead, the thing that really stands out is that canvas on the canvasback. So just think bright white canvas, and on the redhead, got a nice gray body. Again, that head shape, really useful at a distance for canvasback because there's nothing really else that looks like that is a duck. The redhead, wouldn't be so useful alone as a silhouette if you don't have any coloration to go by. But if you can see the red head on it and you can get that head shape, that's another way to ID them. So again, that canvasback has a gentle sloping forehead. If you're on skis, you're probably not too worried, you're not too terrified. But we're going to be saving the redhead slope for, those black diamond skiers because really that forehead is quite steep. It's kind of very, very scooped out. So dark bill on the canvasback and on the redhead, blue-gray with a dark tip. Looks like it was just kind of dipped in some ink and there's like a white halo behind it. Bright white body on the canvasback, gray body on the redhead. Here's a side-by-side kind of live action where you're still getting a bit of that red. You can see that shape overall, nice and kind of a gentle grade here, but really going off the face of a cliff on the redhead. And that body does stand out bright white on the canvasback, and the redhead is just not going to like shine and glow at a distance. And to drive that point home even harder, you could just vaguely make out that there's some red on these guys' heads, but the canvasback, oops, I thought I had animations on that one, sorry. The canvasbacks are the ones with this white body, and it really just glows even in these really terrible lighting conditions. And sometimes this is what you're going to be faced with. You're trying to look at ducks that are just too far away. Your binoculars aren't gathering enough light at that distance, so it's just kind of like blurry and everything is grayed out. You can still identify canvasback at that distance. You can still see that slope on the forehead and that bright white body. And you can still see it, a little bit of reddish here on those redheads, but they all have a nice gray body and it really doesn't stand out like that Canvasback does. Okay, one of the black and white Oreo birds, it's really an Oreo bird, black on the other side, kind of pale in the middle, is the lesser scaup. Medium-sized medium-sized diving ducks. I'm so used to saying dabbling ducks because that's what we've covered up to this point. The drakes are handsome little birds. They have a blue bill with a black nail at the tip there, and their heads are black with a bit of iridescence to it. It can shine a little bit kind of purpley blue, but you can get some green tones on it as well, and we'll compare it to greater scaup as well. Um, their back, however, is that kind of variegated coloration. It looks like what the redhead would look like up really, really close. It's that kind of patterned white and black that at a distance, like in this one here, it really reads as a grayish coloration, and it does stand out from those white sidewalls. So the white stands out at that distance, and you can just see that there's a gray bit going on the back. So it's not all one color, but the rear end and the front end are both overall looking pretty black. They do have a nice yellow eye that nicely stands out a fair ways. And we'll compare this with greater scaup in a little bit, but the wings on these guys are useful for telling the two scaup species apart. And on the lesser scaup, those secondary feathers, what we'd be calling on the speculum for the divers, or for the dabblers. I'm going to be getting those two mixed up. What we would call the speculum on the dabblers, we see it here on the lesser scaup. They are white, those secondary feathers, edged with a little bit of black, and they don't go into the primaries. The primaries are the set of feathers that kind of extend out into the wingtip here. So looks kind of grayish, and that white is restricted to the secondaries. The hen, on the other hand, can look, a little bit variable. They tend, at least to me, to always look a little bit like haggard and kind of surprised. And I think it's a function of having that kind of yellow eye, and they're, you know, a little bit splotchy sometimes, especially during the breeding season. So she's gray brown or chocolate brown overall, some light flecking on some of the feathers depending on where she's at in her molt. And there's usually white at the base of the bill. It's whiter in the non-breeding season, so it can really stand out in the non-breeding season, really quite apparently. But during the breeding season, again, they're trying not to attract tons of attention to themselves. So even that kind of white on that lower bill patch, it kind of fades a little bit. And here's one that's kind of either in transition to, growing in more brown there, or coming out of having grown the brown there, but she's kind of in transition. And these ones here are more typical of what you would see on the breeding grounds during the breeding season. But yeah, a lot of the year, they're going to have that bright white patch at the base of the bill. And it really is a patch. It doesn't kind of fade into it like it does during the breeding season. The bill overall is this kind of dark gray color. And again, the hen is going to be showing the same sort of wing pattern that the drake is. This is a diving invertebrate seeker. So these guys are going to eat, some amount of plants, but they're really going to be focusing on insects, crustaceans, mollusks, and a little bit of plant matter as they get them. You'll find these guys in all kinds of habitats during the breeding season, so wetlands, lakes, rivers. Again, they're going to need that emergent vegetation to nest in. And they're generally silent. I haven't heard too many lesser scaup, but here is what the male's courtship noise sounds like. So almost sounds like, a kid's toy. I don't hear that super often. Maybe some other folks will. At some point, head shape is going to be useful, but it's really only useful when we're going to compare to greater scaup kind of side by side. So we'll talk about head shape in a little bit here because it is one of the clues for them. Lesser scaup are a North American species, and again, one that we see more kind of Manitoba westward and northward. You'll see them back east on migration and further south on the non-breeding grounds. Okie dokie. So telling greater scaup and lesser scaup apart is pretty challenging. We do see greater scaup here, especially on migration. You'll get them breeding in a few places, but by and large, the greater scaup are passing through. And they are very, very similar in appearance to the lesser scaup. And if you wind up just calling them scaup for a long while, yeah, nobody is going to blame you. The Scaup are tricky to tell apart. And, when you're IDing stuff, if you're not sure, it's always better to kind of err on the, well, I can tell you it's a Scaup, or I know it's a yellow legs, or I know it's a dabbling duck hen, than to, if you're, especially if you're reporting data, we don't want you to report data that you're not sure about. You're like, it could be. Just put it down as Scaup of some kind, and that kind of stuff is still useful information, but it's better than a wild guess. So, telling the two apart when the birds are kind of relaxed and on the water, we're going to be looking a little bit here at the head shape. And the greater Scaup has kind of the bulk of, I guess, like the peak of the head, you could call it, a bit more forward on the head. It kind of like has a bulbous looking forehead a little bit, versus the lesser Scaup, which has kind of a little bit more of a peak towards the back, or just more of a rounded head appearance overall. If you do get to see them close up, the patterning on the back can be a little bit different. On average, lesser Scaup have darker and coarser barring, but again, if you're seeing them at a distance, that's just going to read to gray, especially, for the greater Scaup, it is really much more fine. If you happen to get your hands on one of these ducks, or you find one, that has been injured or something, the nail on the tip of the bill is a little bit larger on the greater Scaup and smaller on the lesser, but I don't find that something super useful if you're out there looking at a bunch of ducks on the water. It really winds up being, if they're just, sitting around and they're not flying, kind of that head shape of, the greater Scaup having more of a bulbous looking forehead. The peak is kind of more towards the front of the head, whereas the lesser Scaup has the peak a bit closer to the back of the head. So I know that looks really, really similar, and it is kind of challenging. Both have some amount of iridescence on their head, and there is a bit of overlap on that. So both can show a little bit of green, both can show a little bit of purple. So I wouldn't use the sort of glint of the iridescence that you can sometimes catch, depending if the light is just right, as something diagnostic, because there is some overlap between the two. But otherwise, an Oreo cookie looking bird, dark in the front, dark in the back, and pale in the middle. Nice bright yellow eye and a kind of a light bluish bill. Here's just some lines kind of showing roughly that kind of head shape thing. Again, bulbous on the greater Scaup, and on the lesser Scaup more towards the back. In flight, this is my favorite way to identify them. It becomes a little bit easier. So I was mentioning those secondary feathers on the lesser Scaup. So those secondaries are going to be white, whereas the rest of the primaries, the rest of that wing here, is just going to be paler. It's not going to be bright white. On the greater Scaup, the white on the secondaries kind of extends into the primaries here. So you can see there's just some white kind of peeking through. And if you do get them flying, you can tell that difference apart. So the secondaries, it's really kind of an abrupt, like, yep, the white stops here, whereas the greater Scaup, the white kind of trails on into portions of the primary feathers in flight. And again, if you wind up just calling it a Scaup, especially during, migration season, when you are more likely to have both species, if you just wind up calling them Scaup, you're doing pretty good. During the breeding season, you're more safe, where especially, in the prairie environment, we generally speaking just have the lesser Scaup. There are a few exceptions. There's a few places where you'll get the odd greater, but by and large, we mostly have lesser Scaup nesting further south here. So that's just showing those two wing photos there. And taking a look at the hens, the greater Scaup hen is, again, has a bit more of that bulbous peak towards the front, more prominent white at the base of the bill. But again, if you're seeing them in the breeding season, they tend to have a little bit less of that. The lesser Scaup has the peak a bit further to the back, and on average has less prominent white. If you do happen to see the two species side by side, the size difference becomes evident. And you really do need to see them side by side to get that. It's not something that you would be able to say like, oh, I'm seeing a scaup on the water based on size. It's a greater. You are not going to be able to do that. But if you happen to have them side by side, you can, see the size difference between them because you're looking at the relative difference, right? You're saying like, oh, I have two of them near each other and one of them looks obviously, smaller than the other one does. Somebody's asking if scaups interbreed. I don't think so. But ducks can do weird things, and some of them hybridize with all kinds. Mallards are notorious for this. There's lots of mallard crosses. But yeah, I don't think I've heard of hybrid scaup. That's not to say that it couldn't happen, and that would just be really tricky, I'm sure. Um, I can look into that because that is a really, really good question. I have the sound for the greater scaup male's courtship, so we can hear that here. I must have picked a quack for that one. So I'm pretty sure that would just be the hen calling in her kind of more generic quack. I don't think there's a ton of greater scaup recordings floating around as much as there are lesser scaup ones. So anyway, those are the two scaup. They are tough to tell apart. Again, during the breeding season, the greater scaup tends to be, quite a bit farther north of where most of us are doing our bird watching, but you can get them in some pockets, especially here on the prairies. So keep an eye out for them. It is tough to tell them apart, and if it takes you 5 years to start to feel comfortable, that's probably how long it took me to start to feel comfortable. So don't stress out too much about it. They are kind of challenging. Greater Scaup have quite a wide distribution too, across the northern hemisphere. So always interesting to see why some species are found in those greater areas and like the lesser Scaup just in North America. Not sure why. Okay. Another one that looks similar, especially if you're just looking through, a bird field guide and you're into the black and white duck section, is the ringneck duck. The ringneck is really the least obvious part of this name, and I would really love if this duck had a different name because it sends people looking for something that is really, really tough to see. So the ring neck on the duck is so named for this lighter bit of coloration around the neck. And the bird usually has to be holding its neck up high. And remember, birds can change their posture. Like this one has his neck kind of scrunched low. This one, same species, has his neck, he's just like craning to see something. And if the light hits it just so, you can see that ring around the neck. It was one of those species that was named from a dead specimen. So somebody would have sent, I don't know if it was Audubon who named this one, but whoever named it had received a dead specimen. And, when you're holding something, you're like, oh, there is that is a neat ring of, lighter feathery iridescent around the neck. I'll call it the ringneck duck. In practice, that is the most impractical name for them. Ring-billed duck would be better because you can see this really, really obvious white ring around the bill, on an otherwise very kind of dark head, dark face. The base of the bill itself kind of has a pale kind of M to it. That tip looks like it was dipped in ink, so it kind of resembles the bill of the redhead, but everything else about the bird is fairly different. So this one, you're going to be seeing a black and white Oreo bird, but what I want you to do is focus on the back. So if you see a black and white kind of Oreo bird, is it a scaup? It'll look gray. If it's a ringneck duck, that back will be jet black. It's not going to be gray. It's not going to be white. It's going to be solid black. Their flanks are kind of grayish and that fade to a little bit of a white spur, kind of resembling the white spur that you get in the green-winged teal, but everything else about the bird is quite different. Again, that jet black front, back, okay, you're into the black and white diving ducks, and then that dark back is really, really easy to pick out at a distance. Again, white shows up, but also sometimes like jet black can be quite useful too. So black back, head, breast, and rear end, gray flanks, and depending on the lighting, some of this can look really pale as well. So just mostly focus in on that dark back. And of course, that bright ring around the bill is really, really quite obvious. Yellow orangey eye, And you'll find ringneck ducks in kind of shallow wetlands and fens and bogs in the boreal forest. Not a whole lot exciting going on the wing. It's still pretty, but it's not really anything that stands out as helping you identify the species, black above and the flight feathers, those secondaries and those primaries are kind of just a little bit of grayish, a little bit of white on them, but nothing terribly useful stands out. The hen, she retains that ring on the bill, which is very, very nice for us because it makes her one of the easier ones to separate out of those brownish looking hens. So there's kind of a reddish brown overall. The back tends to be a bit darker than the rest of the body overall. There's a little bit of variation depending on like light and individual. They also have spectacles. So they have a bit more of a prominent eye ring, and they'll oftentimes you'll see a little bit of that kind of tip or that, I don't know, it just looks like a glasses arm just kind of hanging back. So think like little spectacles that she's got, but that ring around the bill is like, yes, slam dunk. That one makes it easy. Thank you, ma'am. That was wonderful. So again, that dark bill with the white ring, super helpful. Darker back, paler on the body, but overall, that kind of red brown, grayish sort of look to her. As a diet, these guys are really an opportunistic generalist. They're happy eating whatever. They will eat, they will dive, and they will also like dabble a bit at the water's surface. So they'll eat seeds, tubers, plant matter, insects, leeches, snails, clams. I always like it when I look up, the diet of some species and they say leeches. It's like, how many dissections did you have to do to find like a whole leech that wasn't digested yet? It's pretty amazing. Um, Here you can just see, and this is a really good reminder of, birds can hold themselves with like good posture, or, they could be like craning to see something, and a photo really just captures a moment in time. So this is the same species, just one is like alert and looking at some. This guy's a little bit more at rest. But you can see right here that kind of sort of ring around the neck, and you can, I guess, just make it out here. But again, I've seen it, I think, in the field once in all the times I've seen ringneck ducks, so it's really not something that's terribly useful. The thing that draws me to it is that black and white bird overall that has a jet black back. Not gray, not white, jet black. And here is some of the calls of the ringneck duck. Pretty quacky sounding. Ringneck duck has a fairly broad distribution across North America, so you'll see it, across a fair swath of it. Doesn't quite get to you know, Vancouver Island, but it looks like you get it out there for the non-breeding season. I haven't been out there, so I can't really speak to what's going on out there for the marsh bird life, but ringneck ducks, fairly widespread species. Okay, ringneck duck versus lesser scaup / greater scaup. At a glance, they're very, very similar on the water. They're similar in size. They're kind of similar in habits. And again, the ringneck duck can also have a bit of iridescence on the head, so they can both have a bit of that head shine. And the back is black in the ringneck duck, and the lesser scaup or the greater scaup, it's going to look gray at a distance. The bill of the ringneck duck, again, really, really handy. That white kind of circle around the tip of it does stand out really, really nicely at distance, whereas on the scaup, it's just going to be more kind of, a bluish, grayish sort of color. The flank will be all white on the lesser scaup, and the black will be grayish. On the ringneck duck, the flank is kind of grayish with a bit of a white spur at the front. So those are those two drakes side by side again. That back, it's really the thing that catches my eye first. And here's a fun little quiz here. So see if you can't figure out if we've got ringneck duck and lesser scaup here and which ones might be which. Keeping in mind some of those hints. So the first thing that always stands out to me when I'm looking at the Oreo looking ducks, again, First thing that catches my eye is that we've got two ringneck ducks here with those dark black backs. You can't see his bill. He's just resting, tucked his head up, but because that jet black back stands out, I can still ID him as a ringneck duck, and you can just see it poking beyond the head of this guy over here, that nice dark back. Those scaup stand out. White sides, gray top. White sides, gray top. The rear ends are really looking kind of brown in this photo, and I wonder if it's a something going on with the light, because normally they don't look gray like that or brownish like that. And these two hens, these are ringneck duck hens, because we have that nice distinct ring around the bill, and she looks like she's wearing some nice bold spectacles. And this last one, I can't tell you. Not sure which one it is. I don't have enough information, and that's just also to reinforce that not every bird that you lay eyes on is identifiable. It just happens. You know, they're facing away, they never give you a good look, they disappear before you got enough information. It's totally reasonable to not be able to identify every single bird that comes across your vision. Okay, let's take a look at our larger brown diving hens. We've got the canvasback up on top. The canvasback is nice and easy to rule out with that kind of long, sloping forehead. You know, you're not going to be terrified if you're putting little man skiing down the duck's head on it. Going to be pretty okay. So the canvasback, I feel, is a little bit easier to rule out than the other ones. She's also going to be a fair bit larger. So let's sub in the ringneck duck. So again, this is another one that has a bit of something to stand out. That ring around the bill, and ring is still in the name, so you can like latch onto that a little bit. There's a ring around the bill. You can see that kind of spectacles. She definitely has one of the more bold eye rings of the diving ducks, and oftentimes you can see little arms of those glasses there. So all of these ducks are going to have that relatively steep forehead. They're not looking like the canvasback at all, and they're all going to be that brownish color. Your Scaup are going to have a bit more of an orangey, yellowish eye to them. So if you can see that, if they happen to be close enough, that's something you can use to pick out the Scaup from that. But between the Scaup and the Redhead, it's not the easiest thing to tell apart. At least for me, I struggle a bit with it. The Redhead, their back tends to be a little bit different than their flanks, and I find there's less of that in the Scaup. But again, there's always exceptions to the rules, and sometimes they are tough to tell apart. But if you can get a look at that eye, the Redhead has a nice dark eye, and the Lesser Scaup has a paler eye. Lesser Scaup tends to be darker brown overall, and the Redhead a little bit warmer brown. Pale base to the bill is never going to be strong and bold like it can be in the Lesser Scaup. And you can see this one here has a fair bit more pale going on the bill. But if you find them confusing, that's because they are. They're not terribly easy to tell apart. Okay, getting away from the land of the diving hens that all look the same, we'll take a left turn now and we will go check out the Ruddy Duck, which is just such a compact, handsome little duck. They are small and really, you know, they have this like thick neck and big head for a relatively small body. They're part of a group called the stiff-tailed ducks, and they often hold their tails stiff up like this. It's really, really cute. Of course, they can do other things with their tail, like in this one here, he's got the tail down, but this silhouette can be really diagnostic. You know, you're seeing it at a distance and you're seeing these like kind of just, it looks like a rubber ducky. I guess that's what it is. It has that kind of shape of a rubber ducky, like big head, small body, fat neck, and a tail that sticks up. So that silhouette is kind of distinct at a distance. They have this kind of stubby little bill, and they're just rusty overall. And of course, that white cheek patch just stands out. And if you do get to see them up close, like high breeding season, the blue on the bill is just the most impossibly sky blue thing that you have seen on an animal. It is just, it really is gorgeous. There is nothing quite like it. So the ruddy duck really does stand out. It's definitely ruddy, you know, reddish brown, kind of rusty overall, black cap. But that white cheek patch stands out, as does the bill, and the body shape overall. The sexes are similar when it comes to the wing, and they're really, really plain. They're just kind of dark overall. There is really nothing really to write home about on their wings. The hens have a similar shape. I find they tend to not hold their tails like kind of straight up like you'll see the drakes do. They'll sometimes have them up, but they won't always just be like really straight up. And I think they're doing that just to impress the ladies, so that the hens don't really have to bother with that. But they still have that kind of really compact rubber ducky shape. They're brown overall, and they have that kind of that white cheek patch as well that has a dark streak through it. So kind of harkens back to the drake with that white cheek patch, but it's pale overall. But overall, you're not really going to confuse this little gal with any of the other diving ducks. The closest thing might be the Bufflehead hen, but the Ruddy Duck really is just so compact. They lay massive eggs for their body size. It's really, really impressive. So quite handsome little ducks. And if you get the chance, they do such a wonderful bubbling display. I'll play the sound for you now because it's just hilarious. Part of how they do it, they're making some sort of noises, and they blow bubbles into the, I'm not sure what is going on and how exactly they managed to do it, but you'll see this happen kind of in the springtime when they're out trying to impress the females. So here is the sound of that bubbling display. Oops, disappeared before I clicked it. There we go. So that is one of the diving ducks that you are likely to hear in the breeding season if you are in an area that has ruddy ducks. And these guys, they like prairie pothole wetlands. They're a small compact duck. They're going to be diving for invertebrates mainly, so they're not concerned about being on a water body that is capable of sustaining fish life. They're going to go after things like insects, crustaceans, zooplankton, aquatic plant parts, and seeds in small amounts. So you'll see them on a wider on more wetlands than you would say other diving species because they can make do with less water overall. 86% of their population nests on the prairie pothole wetland. So it is a really important area for these guys. And just, I couldn't resist. Their little ducklings look a lot like the hens with that white cheek patch and that kind of, you can think about it like the football players where they put that kind of dark stripe, you know, on their cheekbones under their eyes. They kind of look a little bit like that. So just, just a handsome, wonderful little duck. They are, you know, a big Western species. You do also get them in parts of the Great Lakes, but again, 86% of their breeding population nests in the prairie pothole region, which is kind of vaguely this sort of area. So it is a really important area here for them, and you can see that reflected when you go out into a variety of wetlands. If you are in Saskatoon, Hyde Park pretty much always has a pair or two of them. If you go on, there's a little footbridge over a tiny weir there, so there's usually one or two hanging out in that area if you want to get up close and take a peek. I'm telling you, that blue is just absolutely amazing. Okay, I'm chatting a lot. We'll keep going here. Bufflehead are really adorable little ducks. They're small, they're compact. They don't do the same thing that the ruddy ducks do by holding their stiff little tails up, but the drakes are super easy to spot at a distance. Black and white overall, but it looks like, you know, their head looks kind of like a pie chart. So like a good 25% chunk. You know, maybe 20% is this bright white color right on the back of their head. And the rest of their head just shines in the most crazy amount of iridescence. If you get to see them in the right lighting and you get to see them close enough, it looks like an oil slick. Like in a good way, if you will. That kind of rainbow sheen that you get. You can just get all of the colors like this fabulous photo by Glenn Fox here, just absolutely amazing if you get to see them up close in the right kind of lighting. But they are quite small, and because they are jet black and bright white, they stand out at a distance. So that kind of big chunk of a pie chart for that white patch on the back of their head is really going to stand out, quite far at a distance. The wings are kind of dark with a large white patch on kind of part of the secondaries, and on the drake, that kind of patch up here is nice and bright white, but just a gorgeous little bird. A tiny little triangular bill. It's just short and stubby. They're just so cute. I would really like to band them because I'm sure a lot of waterfowl, if you've ever, felt them, there's a lot of spring there. Their feathers are quite curved and often, reasonably stiff, so they're a little bit smaller than what they look like. So there's a fair amount of squish there. I'm sure Bufflehead will be just a treat to band. The hens are also nice and easy. They're dark overall, especially quite dark on the head, but they have an oval patch kind of below and behind the eye that really, again, it's that white. It stands out at a distance. Sometimes you can see that little patch of white on their feathers, but their body is kind of, grayish brown, just kind of darkish, and their back tends to be a little bit darker than their underparts. And again, that kind of harkens back to the drake where he's jet black on top and white below. She's kind of gray below in those same parts and has, a much reduced amount of white. But again, you can still see that overall small, compact shape, stubby little bill, and that white patch behind the eye. These guys are really, really active feeders. It's really hard if you have a group of bufflehead to get an accurate count because they're constantly coming up, going under the water. It just seems like it never stops. And just when you feel like you've gotten a handle of it, you're like, okay, there's seven of them and five of them were drakes. Suddenly you see seven drakes at the same time. And it's just, they're really active feeders and they can stay underwater for a fair bit. So they're going to be after insects and their larvae, crustaceans, mollusks, as well as some seeds. And you'll find these guys on ponds and lakes with trees nearby because they are a cavity nester. And they're tightly linked to the distribution of northern flickers because northern flickers drill out the perfect size hole for bufflehead. So you can see them sometimes kind of on the southern prairies. Oftentimes these are birds that are maybe not breeding, or maybe it's just a bachelor male, or maybe he's done and he's like, oh, I'm just going to go hang out in the treeless areas. So you will see them occasionally, but in the where they're breeding, they need some sort of access to trees, and they can walk a fair distance. This is one of the diving species that does walk fairly decently on land, so their feet aren't quite as far back as some of the other species. Let's give a listen to the bufflehead here. Not a species I have ever ID'd by sound other than, oh, it made a noise and there was a bird that way. That's not something that I would, be able to describe to you off the cuff. So again, most of these guys don't worry too much about what they sound like. Bufflehead have a fairly broad breeding distribution. Back east, you're going to have to be getting into the boreal forest before you see them, but we do see them across a fair bit of the prairies, especially kind of that mixed grass and getting into the aspen parkland where we start to get a bit more trees on the prairie ecosystem. But, they still will nest alongside, if there's like large poplars along a river, you can have them there. But yeah, they definitely need trees in order to nest in an area. Okay, Let's compare the small, dark diving hens. Luckily, we've just got two of them and they're pretty distinctive. The Ruddy Duck is going to have that kind of pale cheek patch with a dark stripe below, and the Bufflehead overall is going to be much darker, kind of a cool toned grays. The Ruddy Duck hen is going to be much more richly, reddish brown, whereas the Bufflehead's got these cool kind of slate tones. Dark head with that white eye patch kind of below and behind the eye, and a very small, stubby looking little bill. So both pretty wonderful little birds. Okay, let's get to the mergansers here. We've got three Merganser species, and most of these you don't really see in a ton of wetlands until you start getting closer to the forest, but you often see them in the wintertime and on migration. And I've had a lot of folks ask about them, so I figured I would do a bit of coverage for them here. These are also divers, but they have really unique bills. They kind of have this hooked saw bill, so it's narrow, it's toothed, like you can see this one given a good yawn here, so they have that serrated edge, and that is really great for catching fish, especially, and hanging on to that kind of soft-bodied prey that might actually be able to get away better than something like a leech would. So we've got the hooded merganser, got the common merganser, and the red-breasted merganser. And here's just a quick look. You can see their legs are a bit more centrally placed on their bodies. So they do have a bit of an easier time walking around than most of the divers. They still need to take off with a bit of a runway to fly, but they can do a fair bit of walking. And especially the hooded and common mergansers, these are tree cavity nesting species, so they have to hop out of that. Their young ones just take a leap of faith and they jump out of that tree. And at that age, they're fluff balls and, much like babies in general, they're made of a lot of cartilage. They're pretty resilient to that stuff. So they just come out and they hit the ground, they bounce, and they're off running. The exception to that is the red-breasted merganser. They nest on land close to water, so they're not hiking kilometers away, but they're not necessarily like needing to be right on the water's edge. It's just in proximity to water, and this allows the red-breasted merganser to have a much more northerly distribution than the other species. The hooded merganser eats primarily aquatic insects, fish, and crustaceans, and they are big crayfish eaters. They just love them. Common merganser tends to eat primarily small fish, will eat other things as well, and the red-breasted, small fish, crustaceans, and also other bits and bobs that they can get. I mean, the common merganser is big enough that, apparently they're eating frogs and small mammals if they can get the chance to. Okay, let's have a quick look at the hooded merganser. This is a very striking merganser. The drakes are just, there's no they're super eye-catching. So they have a black narrow bill, and they have, the drakes, a large black and white crest, and kind of looks like that Bufflehead where it's like part of that pie chart, but it really is a crest. If you were to see them from behind, it narrows to a point, and it is edged in black. And just their whole body is beautiful. They kind of have those rusty flanks, and they've got these nice tertial feathers, which is these ones here on the wings. These are the secondaries over here. The primary is closer to the wingtip, and the tertial feathers. On most bird species, they're not anything to write home about. On the hooded merganser, they are just fabulous looking. So it's a pretty bold, contrasting bird overall. And of course, because it is that hood thing, they can have that hood, held in different ways depending on what they're doing. Like here, a bunch of boys, showing off, trying to be, whoever gets to be the sexiest hooded merganser, I suppose. They're competing for that, whereas these ones here are just kind of holding on to their feathers a little bit more relaxed. You will find hooded mergansers in wooded ponds. So again, they're a cavity nesting species, so even better if they can have a cavity right over the water. So listen to the males in their courtship display. It sounds like a frog. That is a sound I have never heard in the wild, and I would probably just start doubling over laughing if I ever did hear it. So hopefully one day I'll get there in the early season and hear the hooded mergansers making whatever you call that noise, very frog-like. The hens are much more subdued. Their bill isn't quite all dark, but there's a little bit of yellowish on it. And they retain that crest. It's just not flashy. Again, they're not wanting to advertise their presence. So they have a nice big crest, but it's just kind of more brownish, whatever you want to call that color. It's not very flashy. You can still see those nice tertial feathers that they still show, but otherwise, overall, she's kind of just this brown and a cool tone overall. There we go. I called it frosted brown crest here. So narrow bill with yellowish below and dark above. Hard to mistake with that wild hairdo, even if the crest is held down. It kind of just looks like a hammerhead. Very, very cute little duck. Broad distribution, we kind of miss out on them in parts of the prairies. Again, they need some of those cavities to nest in, and for whatever reason, we don't tend to see them as far in the western forested areas as you do, but you will occasionally get them in Saskatchewan. Of course, you get them in Manitoba and parts of Alberta as well, but fairly broad distribution. Okay, common and red-breasted drakes. Luckily, these two are really easy to tell apart. So the common merganser here is at the top, and the red-breasted is here on the bottom. So the common merganser overall, black above and white below. That head has a dark iridescent green in both species, but again, at a distance, in non-ideal lighting, it's just going to read quite dark black. So dark head, dark back, and then bright white kind of flanks and chest. Common mergansers are also quite large, and you will see them. They will hang out. So, like in Saskatoon, we can get them on the river here year round, or at least in the winter time. Maybe they don't hang out in the breeding season. Anyway, we do get them here on the river for sure in the winter time, and they are a large bird. Both of them have that sawbill, and both of them it is nice and red. The red-breasted merganser has kind of reddish and mottled dark on the breast, and overall the body just has a lot more complexity going on. That white collar is something that again stands out at a distance being white, and they have kind of a shaggy, wispy crest. It's not always up and looking crazy like that. Oftentimes it's just kind of held down and you'll just see a little bit of a shaggy crest going on. But if it's really up, it looks like it's thinning. It doesn't look quite as, big and luxurious as the hooded mergansers for sure. That red eye also just adds a pop of contrast on the head. But overall, a very patterned merganser as compared to the common. And both of them are going to be fairly large, but the common is going to be a fair bit larger than even the red-breasted. But red-breasted does have a bit of that red breast going on. The wings, largely the same between the two species and nothing super useful for identification. The hens, this is where these two get tricky, and this is something that I've struggled with for a long time as well, because it wasn't a species that I saw terribly often. But the thing to remember for the hens is commons have contrast and red-breasted blends. So commons have contrast. What am I talking about here? Both of them overall have kind of this grayish body and a bit of a pale front of their neck and chest sort of area, and reddish head. They also have a reddish bill. And where they're different is how the color of the head kind of interacts with the rest of the body. So on the common merganser, there is a sharp contrast line between the coloration of the head and the coloration of the neck. Both of them can have a bit of a shaggy crest going on too, so that's not the most useful thing to focus in on here. But that head color contrasting sharply with the rest of the neck color. In the red-breasted merganser, that head color just kind of blends and fades into everything else that's going on the neck. The common merganser also has this kind of white little chin patch here, and that can, again, be really, really useful in terms of ID. It is a bright white chin patch. It's not like, am I seeing one? Are you trying to invent one here? Like, no, it is sharply contrasting, well delineated between the two. So Again, common has lots of contrast, and for the red-breasted, it blends into one another. So that's a bit of a trick to help tell them apart. But if you just get to the point where you're like, that is a Merganser hen, I'm not sure, you're doing a great job. So let's give a quick listen to the common Merganser male courtship noises. Weird. They all kind of sound like frogs. And here for the red-breasted merganser. So I have never heard any of these sounds out in the wild. So if you ever do, count yourself lucky, or maybe you just like to get out earlier in the season than I wind up getting out. Okay, let's look at these two hens side by side. Some of the females can get a little bit of a dark spectacle going on, but it's not all of them. Again, here we have the common merganser on the bottom. The common has contrast. And the red-breasted merganser, it just kind of blends in. There, you can see there's some pale parts, but it doesn't have that kind of really high contrast line. There's like a definite line between the color of the head and the color of the rest of the neck, either, behind and in the front as well. So pretty handsome little birds. The common merganser has a very wide distribution across North America and across a bunch of the Northern Hemisphere more generally. The red-breasted merganser also has a quite wide distribution across North America, but tends to, at least in the West, be restricted much more into the forested areas and a fair bit, down here as well. Really more closely tied to the forest areas, but it does get up into, the treeless tundra where they do, because they're not a cavity nester, they're free to go as far north. Why they don't hang out further south? Beats me, not sure. This is another one with a wide distribution across, the northern parts of the globe. Phew, we got through it. only a little bit over time. So to recap the birds that we covered today, we had a bunch of look-alike species. We have the canvasback and the redhead. We have the ringneck duck, the lesser scaup, and the greater scaup, kind of our Oreo cookie birds. And we've got that bufflehead, which has that kind of big pie chart sticking out the back of the bird's head. We've got the ruddy duck, and then our merganser species. We've got the hooded merganser, the common merganser, and the red-breasted merganser. So way to go, folks. We did it. So if you ever want to get in touch, this is my information here. You can visit the Prairie Canada MarshWatch website at that URL. Birds Canada is on a bunch of the different socials. Visit our website at birdscanada.org. We are a national not-for-profit, and donations from folks like you help keep us running. So if you're in a position to make those charitable donations, I hope you'll consider us in your gifting portfolio or your plans if you're able to do so, but I get it, not everybody is. I'd like to give a big shout out to all of our supporters, the Manitoba Habitat Conservancy, the Government of Canada, the Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment's Fish and Wildlife Development Fund, SAS Power, and of course, Wildlife Habitat Canada. Thanks to all of you. And again, thanks to all the photographers, who make their photos available for this kind of stuff. It really helps to bring educational material alive, and that's part of why I like getting, a lot of these photos from iNaturalist, because they do opt in to say, yes, I want to make all of my photos, available under these copyright licenses. So, use for non-commercial or educational purposes, you can set your photos to do that. So it really does, sometimes help in ways that you might not think are so obvious. But thank you guys so much for tuning in. I know that was a lot of species crammed into one and a lot of confusing species. So just remember, if you're getting started with the waterfowl, the drakes is the way to go. Start there and get a handle on those ones. And the hens will eventually come along for the ride, especially in the early season as they're migrating. Like I said, they often arrive in the breeding grounds already paired, so you'll often get that great chance to see the two side by side, because Man, it can be tough, and sometimes it takes years to get familiar with the differences between a couple of species. So if you're having trouble, take heart. It's because they're hard. You're doing a great job. I will end it here for the